Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first of two 2020 CFE ARLI Policy Forum events. I'm Sarah Happy Knight, the Co-Executive Director of CFE and the Manager of Programs, and I'm delighted to have all of you with us. First, I want to address the current climate, recognizing how painful and horrifying this time has been for many of our CFE community and CFE family members. At CFE, we uplift and empower educators of color in an effort to support equitable and just student experiences. We value the importance of self-examination and the power of self-reflection to drive action, and know how important both are when educating Chicago youth, many of whom are Black and Brown within this current societal context. While our efforts will not solve the systemic injustices our community battles, we remain committed to providing anti-racist growth opportunities to the educators and students of Chicago. Many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. That welcome slide that was up when you first came in provided a few notes just to keep in mind throughout the course of this evening's event. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentations. I'm sure most of us are familiar with Zoom etiquette at this point, but that would be really helpful. Also, the entire event will be recorded and shared with our educator community, our board of directors, our donors, and potential donors. So if you have any issues with that, feel free to turn your video off. Also, we really encourage you to ask questions of our amazing presenters this evening. If you have questions during the presentations themselves, you're welcome to pop those in the chat, specifically to Kate Carter, who will be facilitating the Q&A for each of our four presenters tonight. If you have questions during the Q&A itself, we ask that you use the raise your hand function to ask your question out loud. Kate will also facilitate that process. One final thing is that we have a feedback form for you to complete for each presenter you have the pleasure of viewing tonight. I will pop that link into the chat box after each presentation concludes. So tonight we are showcasing 4 of our 8 ARLI Fellows, and we hope you enjoy their inspiring accounts of student research and discovery. Before we move into the presentations, I would like to introduce Dr. Sue Hansen, who has served as the primary advisor for our ARLI program for more than 15 years. Very sadly, this is Sue's last year working with us, and we will all miss her expertise and guidance dearly. Thank you so much, Sue. I'll toss it over to you now.
Okay, hello everybody, good evening. Thank you for being with us. We are so happy to have these presentations tonight because, of course, this year's ARLI Fellows have had a really terrible year with 11 days off for the strike and then school closing in mid-March, when typically data collection would be ramping up. So everyone's made it work in some way, all of these 8 people, and we're very, very proud of them and thrilled that they've done that. I wanted to say a little bit to you about action research, because I'm assuming that some people who are present do not know what it's about. Action research is a pretty extraordinary process when it's applied in the classroom, because it gives teachers power over their own classrooms. It's not an external expert coming in and telling them what they should be doing. They're finding out from themselves what works and what doesn't, and through their own hard work, and it is a very, very complicated process. It begins with forming a question and then collecting data in the classroom to answer the question, analysing the data, and then making changes according to what is found from the data. In very, very simple terms, that's what it is. But it's not an easy process. A teacher is by nature completely and utterly involved in what they're doing. So they're very immersed in their classroom. A researcher has to be a little bit distant from what they're researching, because otherwise they can't really look at it very clearly. And the process of data collection does give a little bit of distance. But our fellows have to do that dance between being immersed and being at a distance. And they've all managed it really extremely well. The rewards from this is greater understanding of the classroom, greater understanding of their students, a sense of power over what they can do, and their confidence in their own teaching. And in the case of ARLI Fellows, it also comes with a really wonderful fellowship with everybody in their group. So that's just a little bit of background to kind of try and explain to you the amazing work that these people have done this year. So I'm going to pass you over to Kate, who has been my other half this year. It's been quite wonderful working with somebody else, bouncing stuff back and forth. And Kate is a very good, well, she initiates a lot, and that's really wonderful. So Kate, will you take over from here?
Thank you, Sue. Hi, everybody. It is so wonderful to see you here. We are really excited about the presentations that we have tonight. In this kind of climate right now, it's easy as an educator to feel kind of like you don't have much power. And these 4 educators show us that you absolutely do. So you're in for a treat. The way it's going to work is we'll have 20-minute talks. During those time, please chat me if you have any questions. It'll chat just to me, or make sure you're chatting just to me. I also put chat for Q&A in my name to make that a little bit easier. You can also wait and do a raise hand function during the live Q&A after each presentation if you want. And without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our first presenter of the evening and our first presenter of our ARLI Policy Forums this year. Helena Jankowski, take it away.
Okay, guys, give me 1 second. Okay, so like Kate just said, my name is Helena Jankowski. I am a special education teacher at Murray Language Academy, and I was researching promoting student self-esteem using goal setting and self-evaluation. Just before we get started, I have a quick disclaimer because this is happening over video and it's, unprecedented times. I just wanted to say a blanket statement that to protect my students' privacy, all of the names in this presentation have been replaced with pseudonyms. So a little bit about my school. I teach, like I said, at Murray Language Academy. It is a public elementary school located in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago. We have approximately 456 students enrolled in kindergarten through 8th grade. What makes Murray special is that we are a magnet school, which means that we draw students from all over the city of Chicago. We're not bound by neighborhood boundaries. And the reason that we're a magnet school is that we offer a special world language program where students study Mandarin, Spanish, or French throughout their tenure at our school. So a lot of students enter in kindergarten and leave in 8th grade having studied a language that whole time, and they actually are able to earn a seal of biliteracy, which is really cool and a great opportunity for the students. And just a few key demographics that I want to draw your attention to. Approximately 91% of the students at my school are African American, 64% are considered low income, and then 15% of the student population receives special education services. And that in particular is important because I am the middle school special education teacher at Murray. So I serve the 7th and 8th grade students at my school. I have 17 students on my caseload. 10 of them are 7th graders and 7 are 8th graders. I also work with 2 amazing classroom assistants who are dedicated to students that have some more intensive needs that need one-on-one support. I have a wide range of disabilities represented in my classroom, but the most common ones are specific learning disability, autism, cognitive impairment, and other health impairments. And then I provide my students with specialized instruction in language arts, math, science, and social studies. And so as I've worked with my students, I've noticed that they talk about themselves in a pretty specific way. And these are some of the words that I have heard directly my students use to describe themselves. And they might not be positive words, but they're definitely powerful words. And every time I hear students say this, it gets really frustrating because I know that they're capable of so much more than they think they are. But day after day, I hear them use these words and I hear them use the phrase over and over again, I can't do this. And it's not just my students. So research is actually showing that when students start to experience learning difficulties, it has a negative impact on their developing academic self-concept, so how they view themselves as students. And after experiencing instances of failure in an academic setting, students with disabilities are actually shown to be more likely to display negative emotions like a sense of hopelessness compared to their peers that do not have identified disabilities. So that information kind of got me thinking about how I can help my students. And I started to wonder what would happen to student self-esteem in a middle school resource room when an emphasis is placed on goal setting and self-evaluation. Would it change the way my students see themselves? So I started a data collection plan to kind of get some information. So first of all, I formed a focus group of 4 of my 8th grade students. And these are students that I actually was lucky enough to work with the year previous. So I had a really long-standing relationship with them already. And I was able to conduct one-on-one interviews with them and give them a particular focus as I was journaling and kind of looking more closely at my data. We did weekly goal setting sheets, which provided me with a wealth of information. We did a weekly check-in, check-out system, which I will be explaining in just a minute. But this is where my students were really getting to practice setting and evaluating their weekly short-term goals. I had quarterly one-on-one conferences with students that allowed me to set longer-term goals with them and look at their thinking from that context. There were also questionnaires made available to my students, which were short surveys that helped capture their thinking. And then finally, as a teacher, I kept a journal throughout the entire research process to allow me to record thoughts real time in my classroom, as well as reflect on the day-to-day goings on. And then just to kind of orient you, these are my 4 8th grade case study students. I love each of them dearly. I did have a fun time working with them this year, and we're going to be looking at their work more in depth. But we have Kaylon, Gabby, Jamal, and Star. And so you're going to see them throughout represented by their picture and their favorite color. So look for that throughout this presentation. So early in the first quarter, before I had started kind of working with them on goal setting, I sat down with all of my students. This was like the first week or 2 of school. Individually, we discussed the new school year, how they were feeling, like, you know, what they were looking forward to, what they were dreading. And a really popular subject was classes that they want to do better in, especially the 8th graders who are getting ready to go to high school. And so in terms of academics, many of the students indicated that they most wanted to improve in science. 4 students said that, and then 3 indicated math. You might notice that there are a few subjects on here that are considered like non-academic subject areas, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And that's particularly important because you might notice that more students said they wanted to improve in athletics than they did reading or social studies. I am guessing that a lot of my students feel more confident in reading and social studies, and their grades tend to reflect that as well. And the reason that I kept subjects like athletics and the arts on there is because for a lot of my students, those are extremely important to them and are highly motivating for them. So for example, Kaylon is a star football player. Actually, he got to go to a really special event in Florida where his team got to go and compete in a special championship tournament there this year. So that was a really exciting time for him. But he told me he chose athletics because this year he wanted to be made the captain of the football team, and he wanted to become a better leader to his team. So just because athletics is not like a core academic subject that I might assess in my classroom doesn't mean that it's not important to my students and it's not important for their learning. So I chose to keep that on there. My other 3 case study students all selected academic areas. So Gabby and Jamal chose reading and Star chose math. But what I noticed when I was talking to them about these academic areas, they were really struggling to tell me why they wanted to improve in them. They had a really hard time finding the words. They were just like, I don't know, like I'm just not good at it, or I want to get better grades. You know, they didn't really have a deeper reason within themselves that they were hoping to improve in reading or improve in math. And when I asked kind of like the follow-up question, well, do you think you're a good student? They all told me no. And they referenced those grades that they wanted to improve. No, I'm not a good student because I did not do well in math last year, for example. In that same interview, I asked my students to identify specific skills and strategies that they could develop to help support them in meeting their goals for the year. And I intentionally left this open-ended because I wanted to see what they knew, like what tools they already might have in their toolkit that they could tell me about. And I was actually impressed with some of the strategies that they came up with on their own. So many of my students, 7 and exactly, told me that they needed to pay more attention in class. 4 told me they needed to study more, and 3 told me they wanted to make sure they turned their work in on time. And those were the most popular examples brought up by my students. And so I knew that I could take advantage of those as I continued to work with them throughout the year on goal setting. So after I kind of had this baseline idea of where my students were at as students and goal setters, I decided that the time was now to start teaching them how to set goals. So we used explicit instruction, weekly check-ins, and focused support to really hone in on that ability. And I'm going to kind of talk about each of these in turn. In terms of explicit instruction, first of all, my school is what's called a Leader in Me school. Leader in Me is actually a program that is based on the really popular 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And so you may have heard of this before. There's 7 key habits that help you become a good leader, a good person. And 3 in particular really pertain to what I was trying to do with my students. So begin with the end in mind really has to do with focusing your time and energy on the things that can be controlled in your life, having a plan, defining outcomes before you act. Put first things first means to focus on your most important priorities and stick to them. And then sharpen the saw means to always seek opportunities for continuous improvement. And those 3 really lend themselves very well to goal setting and becoming, a better student. My school also has, along with Leader in Me, what we call leadership notebooks that are used school-wide for students to kind of monitor their progress and showcase their achievements. They're kind of like portfolios. And in those, they have to set what are called wildly important goals, or WIGs. But after using these with my students for a whole year already, I knew that that wasn't enough for them. So I took this and I knew that I had to build on it. So I decided to use a specific framework called SMART goals to help kind of frame their thinking. So if you're not familiar with SMART goals, it's basically kind of a list of criteria of like what makes a good goal. So goals should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And I gave students specific lessons on this, and we focused kind of on each element. Students first practiced by writing goals based on scenarios I gave them, like kind of made up stories that they would have to set goals for a character in the story. And then eventually we were able to move on where they started setting goals for their own lives based on things that they wanted to improve on. And one of the ways that they did this was we instituted what are called weekly check-ins. And this is where we really started working on those short-term goals. So this became a huge part of our daily routine in class. So every Monday at the start of class, they knew they got out their Chromebook and they opened this Google form. And in the form, they had to set a goal for reading, math, and then a personal or non-academic goal. And they also had to talk about what I, as their teacher, could do to help them. And then I was then able to know what they were hoping to work on for the week. And I was able to check in with them and kind of help them along as the week progressed. And like I said, it became a really big part of our routine that I didn't even have to tell the students. They just knew to come in and get started. Really similarly, on Fridays, we would do a checkout, and that is where they would self-evaluate and reflect on those goals they set on Monday. And you can see here kind of some of the examples of the things they had to talk about. They had to talk about like how they thought their progress went, things that I could do to help them more if I didn't do it already, things that they think they need to do a better job of in the next week. So they would have to kind of look back on their week, how things went, and then look forward what they were hoping to do next week. And then they could, build on that on Monday when they had to set their next set of goals. So it really kind of built up onto each other. Then to kind of work on some of the longer term goals, I had quarterly conferences with my students. And that was when, again, they looked back on the last quarter and then they looked ahead to the quarter that was coming. And that allowed them to kind of set a longer term goal that couldn't just be achieved in a week. So you can see here some work that that Kaylon was able to do. I know it has a picture of Star, sorry, that Kaylon was able to do for quarter 3. So another important element that I brought in was we also use like the NWEA MAP assessment to show academic achievement. And that was an element that was able to be tied in as well because they had goals that they were working on for that as well. So it was really integrated into many different aspects of our classroom. And then I kind of started to suspect, especially as I was reading the weekly check-ins, that they were kind of just going through the motions without really thinking very deeply about the reasoning behind their goals or without understanding what their goals actually meant. And so I decided that I needed to provide a little bit more focused support. so that we could really zero in on those students who were struggling to set those realistic quality goals independently. And I kind of monitored that and identified those students based on what I was reading in those weekly check-ins as I reviewed them. And so all of the students would be able to, that needed it, were able to receive individual check-ins and feedback with either myself or one of my classroom assistants. So you'll see in this picture, Kaylon is working with one of my amazing classroom assistants, Ms. Jenkins. All 4 of the case study students that we're going to be talking about actually received this focused support for some or all of the school year. And really one important thing that came of this is I realized how important it is to really motivate students and build them up with positive language and a positive mindset. And that's something that Ms. Jenkins is really good at in this picture. That's one of the reasons I chose to include it. She makes students feel great about themselves, and you can really see the difference. So as I worked with students, one of the main ways that I was able to help them was through questioning. So here's kind of a conversation I was having with Star in January. This was on a Friday. She was really struggling to evaluate this goal she had set for herself for multiplication facts. She didn't really know like where to start. And so I was able to ask her some questions like, what do you notice about your work from Monday until now? How do you think you grew this week? How does that make you feel? Those are questions that she wasn't naturally inclined to ask herself as she was reflecting, but I was able to do that with her and get her thinking through it. And then the more we were doing this together, the more she was able to start asking those questions herself. And I was able to see that come out in her reflections on her own without me. Really similarly, Gabby is an amazing dancer. And at the beginning of the school year, she was writing some good goals, but they were all about dancing, which I didn't want to stop her from doing because like I said in the beginning, it's really important to me that they get to talk about the things that are important to them. So instead of saying, no, you can't do that, I let her write those dancing goals, which were great models of quality goals. But then I also pushed her to apply that knowledge of goal setting to some of her academic goals, like add on, write a reading goal now. Like what can you do in reading and how do we turn that into a goal? And so you see here, as I talked to her, she was able to tell me what she needed to work on. And she was able to tell me even like a strategy that she could use to help her reach that goal by highlighting the text evidence, which she wanted to work on. So like Sue said, expectations of the school year were not reality. So I thought this was going to go really smoothly. But as we know, this was more like what my process looked like. We had the teacher strike, we had COVID-19, but one good thing I learned and was able to see was that students are really resilient. And actually, I think that the goal setting that I was doing with the students really helped kind of keep them on track, even through all of these ups and downs. So this is a really quick snapshot, a really good example of how my students' goal writing evolved through the year. So in September, Star was writing goals like just do good at math. That was the goals I was getting from her. But then by March, you can really see those SMART goal elements really start to pop out. She said, by Friday, I will pass my 12's multiplication tables 3 times with no mistakes. That's a really specific goal. It's measurable. That is a great example and so far from where we were in September. They were able to tell me why goals are important. So it's important to set goals so that you could become better at the things you aren't good at, or you need to keep track of what you're trying to accomplish. How do you work on your goals? This is where I really started to see so many progress, like markers for my students. I was able to really see some really specific strategies that I didn't even teach them. These are things that they learned themselves through the process. So Kaylon told me you need to make a plan, then you can follow that plan step by step until you meet your goal. Gabby said, I like to write my goal down and put it where I can see it every day so that it reminds me. I never told her to do that, but that's something that she figured out worked for her. When I was talking to Jamal, he had my favorite example. So he told me he likes to picture the goal in his mind, and then he kind of compared it to when you lose something and you have to retrace your steps. He said he likes to picture the goal at the end and then work backwards from there so that he knows what he needs to do to reach the finish line. And I thought that that was like a really sophisticated strategy. And something that I was like, wow, like that's a great idea. I'm going to start doing that when I set goals. Good idea. Also, he shared that when he has trouble, because sometimes, you know, your goals don't always go perfectly. There are going to be bumps in the road. He just keeps going and asks for help when he needs it. And that's how he does most of his learning, is through the struggle. And that's a really important thing for students to realize. He told me that when he reaches his goal, like seeing that I got work done and right makes me feel good. it isn't right all the time, but I always try to do it. And if I'm wrong, I will keep trying so that I can have it right and understand. This shows that he's starting to kind of be more deeply motivated than just, I want to get good grades. Really similarly, talking to Gabby, here's her reflection that she shared.
I actually feel good when I reach my goal because that makes me realize that I'm getting better at my work and stuff that I needed help with. And that makes me feel like really good inside, and I'm getting better at learning.
So Gabby said, it makes me realize that I'm getting better. And that realization is really the key, just like her, and then just like what Jamal said, that realization that by making my goals, like I can make progress, even if it's small steps at a time. That realization is key. And you might remember, these are the words that I said my students were using to describe themselves at the beginning of the year, especially, I can't do this. And they started to see that they could do it. And so as they went, they started to say, I can do this. And these are the sorts of words at this point in the school year that they are starting to use about themselves. And they are much more positive, much more growth oriented than how they were talking about themselves at the beginning of the year. And that shows me that a change in mindset really did start to occur. So just some quick conclusions. When given the opportunities to practice, the student goal setting improved. They got more specific, they got more realistic, and they got more relevant. When students were given a choice over their goals, they showed more interest and like a deeper motivation in their learning. And then as they saw that they were able to achieve their goals, their self-esteem improved, and so did their classroom independence. So it had a really powerful impact on my classroom and my students. And so I developed a few specific policy recommendations that I think any teacher could implement into their classroom. First, I think that it's important to explicitly teach goal setting. We can't just assume that students know how to set a goal, how to work towards it, and then what to do if they meet their goal or if they don't meet their goal. So it's important to work on short and long-term goals. You need to find a framework and then stick to it. I use SMART goals, but there are a lot of other methods for writing a quality goal that you could explore with your students. And then it's also important to not just turn them loose, but keep track of their progress, look at the goals they're setting, and then provide additional supports as needed with individuals or even in a small group. Second, it's important to make goal setting part of your classroom routine. This was, I think, one of the biggest parts of the success of my students. They got opportunities to practice and improve their independence after that explicit instruction occurred. Goal setting became like a normal thing for them. And that is where they really started to develop some of those strategies that I didn't even teach them all the time. And as that improved, I again saw their goals start to get more specific, more realistic, more relevant. And that is really what I like to see. And then finally, I think it's also important to provide opportunities for self-evaluation as well. You can't just set the goals and then never do anything with them. You need to look back and reflect, and then you need to use that information to look ahead and set new goals for yourself. This needs to be a part of the routine too. I really think that this was the bread and butter of what caused that shift in my students' mindset, where they really started to see that they are capable of success, and that really helped foster that self-esteem within themselves. And so they're seeing that hard work pay off, and that increased their self-esteem. And now I will take questions.
All right, thank you so much, Helena. From all of our homes, we're giving you some applause out here. Yes, I see a lot of the hand applause like that. As we are starting to think about questions for Helena, and I do have a first one to get us going with, I do want to direct everyone's attention to the chat box where Sarah has just shared a feedback form for Helena. We are all practicing and we all want to be able to get better. And so please share some, kudos and also some ideas for Helena. And I'm going to remind you of this after each presentation as we go into the Q&A. So I have a first question for you, and I'm going to start with the one that went to everybody, which was, what do you hope is going to happen for these students next year based on this work?
So because I'm a middle school teacher, I think that it's twofold. First of all, for my 8th grade students, I hope that I'm sending them off to high school with a really solid foundation, because now they're the little fish in the big sea again. They're used to being the biggest kids in school. You know, they're the oldest, most mature kids, and now they're going to be freshmen. And high school can be a really hard transition, especially for students with disabilities. And so my hope is that with some of these tools that they learned, especially for how to work toward these goals that they're setting for themselves, that they will find success in high school. They have to approach interacting with their teachers differently. All of these different aspects, I think that I'm really setting them up for success. And that really shone through with those strategies that they were talking about towards the end, where they were talking about, you know, like working backwards from your problem, or putting the Post-it note like on your bathroom mirror in the morning so you can remind yourself every day of what you're working toward. I think that that's really important. And then for my 7th graders, soon to be 8th graders, I know that I'm getting another year with them. And so I'm hoping to continue to build off of that. These are all things that I plan to keep doing in my classroom, even though this project might be ending. And I think that I've already seen a tremendous amount of growth, especially considering the crazy interruptions we've had this year between the strike and COVID. So I'm hoping that we can just get, you know, a regular start to finish school year next year. I would really be interested to see what they're going to be like after having a whole second year of really intensely focusing on goal setting and building themselves up.
Thank you. I have a question from Sylvester Baugh, who is making some connections to theory, and he was asking, have you ever taken any training or done any work with choice theory or reality therapy?
I actually have not. I will make note of that and look into it. Thank you.
So Sylvester, that would be a great thing then to also put in your feedback form as additional resources.
That would be really helpful.
Yeah, as educators, we love to get more ideas like that. A question from Jody Horde, a past fellow. She asked if you will have opportunities to share these findings with your school community.
Yes, I'm really hoping to. I'm not sure if anybody from my staff ended up signing up for this. I haven't checked the respondents list, but my principal does know about the work I was doing. And like I said, we're a leader in B school. And so because of some of those factors that I pointed out to you in the presentation, goal setting is something we do school-wide. And this was really an experiment that I did with my students, like putting a big emphasis on it, because kind of before it was kind of just done in passing. It was done in the quarter. We would update like our data. They would like shade in some grass, and the students weren't really thinking, I would say, as deeply about what they were doing and why they were doing it. So my students really got that intensive taste of setting really quality goals, why it's important, and what you can do with them. That's the piece that I personally think is kind of missing from what we are doing school-wide. And so I'm really hoping to talk more with my school team about this and bring these ideas to my team so that we can kind of work that into what we do have existing, because I do have a good framework existing with the leadership notebooks, but it can be so much better. And I think that some of this really focused effort would really go a long way to improving what students are getting out of those leadership notebooks that we do school-wide.
Thank you. A related question of sorts then from Anthony Vesco is, were you able to share these goals with parents? And it sounds like you did talk with your teaching assistants, but like, what did those conversations look like with the members of your direct community in order to assist with goal reinforcement and accountability around goal setting and progress monitoring?
Absolutely. So we did talk about this with parents. So our first fall parent-teacher conferences, parents were kind of made aware of the work we were doing in our classroom, and students were able to talk about the goals that they had been setting for themselves up to that point. The plan was this spring, students were going to do student-led conferences to kind of really walk their parents through. I didn't get into this as much because parent-teacher conferences were not done face-to-face because of COVID-19, and I wasn't really able to do student-led conferences like I had planned. But the original idea, and something I'm hoping to do next year, is allow the students to lead the conferences and then really speak to what they're doing in terms of goal setting and how that is translating to the work that they are turning in, to the grades they are getting in, not just my classes, but the classes that they might have with other teachers as well, because this is hopefully a skill that we would see transfer across all the settings. So the parents are really interested in that, and that is work that we're hoping to continue into next year.
Thank you. One last question for you. A lot of us were noticing that you had May of 2020 results up here, and that was really great to see, given that we haven't been face-to-face in the same way with students during this time. And Sue is particularly curious about hearing about how the data collection worked during that time, during the school closure, and if you were able to continue working on goal setting during that time.
Yes, so I did continue working on goal setting with my students. As you saw, I did have, like you mentioned, a few May 2020 pieces of data. They continued with their weekly check-in because I was already using a Google form that translated over so nicely to remote learning. It just was one more thing on their daily to-do list in my Google Classroom that I use with them. And that was at least one thing that transitioned really smoothly because it was already such a big part of our routine. It was already online. That was just one thing that I didn't have to worry about changing over once we switched to completely online teaching. So that was a way I continued to gather data. And then for my students in particular, the case study students, those were the ones who were left that were still receiving kind of some focused support from me. And so I made sure that I would provide them written feedback kind of on those goals. We're not in CPS allowed to meet one-on-one with students just because of certain guidelines that the district has put in place. So unfortunately, I kind of lost that ability to do one-on-one face-to-face feedback, but I did still read all of my students' goals and I provided written feedback to them about their goals. And by this point in May, they were already making a lot of progress in terms of how their goals were written and the types of goals that they were setting. So it was more like fine tuning a few things. Or when we first switched over to remote learning, I don't want to say we got lazy, but I think the transition, we kind of forgot some of the things we learned. So they needed a quick reminder of like, what are the elements of a SMART goal, that sort of thing. And with that quick reminder, we were able to kind of get back on track in our weekly goal setting. And so my feedback has kind of gotten less and less as it's gone on, just because they've been able to pick it right back up.
Helena, thank you so much. You've been our trailblazer in what is a completely unprecedented way of doing these presentations. We really appreciate your hard work and for setting us up so well for the rest of the evening. So thank you. Silent or loud applause for you. And now relax. And next up, we have wonderful work from Evan Trad.
My name is Evan Trad, and I would like to welcome you to my presentation, The Journey to Self-Advocacy Through Picture Books. Why is self-advocacy so important for students, especially in an elementary inclusion classroom? In my tenure as a special education teacher, I have witnessed countless times students with disabilities will wait for a teacher's support when they need help. Specifically, students will often signal that they need help by doing one of three things. 1, sit passively and wait for the teacher to notice them. 2, raise their hand to get their teacher's attention. Or 3, create some sort of behavior disturbance to get the teacher's attention. Lastly, inclusion is a movement in the educational system that provides special education support in the classroom. It has been my observations and experiences that when students are fully included, they will often rise to the challenges that their non-disabled peers do. Through this rise in expectations, students with disabilities have had their educational bar raised and have often rose to or exceeded those expectations. With this rise in expectations, students should be able to self-advocate for their needs. This rationale leads to my question of my research. What happens when I teach my students self-advocacy skills in an inclusion classroom? Before we get into the process and findings of my research, it's important to understand my school. Helen C. Pierce of International Studies is a level 1 school located in the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago. Pierce has 1,081 students in grades K to 8. There are 51.6% of those students who are free or reduced lunch, and 13% of the student population has diverse learning needs. Of those students with diverse learning needs, 83% are fully included, where all of their special education supports are provided within the general education classroom. Pierce is also an International Baccalaureate World School. More specifically, my classroom is made up of 28 bright-eyed and creative 4th graders who are eager to learn. There are 14 girls and 14 boys. 8 of the students have diverse learning needs with a diagnosis of LD, or learning disability. My co-teacher and I have been working together for over 5 years, so we have our co-teaching dance almost mastered. So what is self-advocacy? There are many definitions, but for the purposes of our work, the students and I defined it as, quote, awareness of what we need or want and being able to communicate it to others. When looking at the skills needed to self-advocate, there are 4 components that students need to have mastered to effectively self-advocate. These components include awareness of self, strengths and weaknesses, goal setting, and finally, communication. The focus of my research was to explicitly teach these 4 skills to the students using picture books and projects. The first component of self-advocacy is awareness of self. We also refer to this as identity, and we're able to connect work that we started back in fall to this idea. In the fall, students completed a unit on identity where they learned who they were through picture books and finally created identity maps to show who they were as children and students. In the fall, we read 4 picture books that included The Day You Begin, The Invisible Boy, The Wall in the Middle of This Book, and Enemy Pie to learn and explore the idea of identity. To continue that work and connect it to self-advocacy, we read the book Red, a Crayon Story, where a blue crayon in a red wrapper learns who he is throughout the course of the story with the help of another crayon. Students connected the journey of the crayon to identity and understanding who you are and its importance. Next, we explored our strengths and weaknesses using the book I Will Never Get a Star on Mrs. Benson's Blackboard. We read the book together and discussed how the main character had to learn what she was good at to finally earn a star on the blackboard. My co-teacher and I planned an art activity to connect the book where students would explore their own strengths and weaknesses and showcase them in an artistic way. But then in March, the governor closed schools due to the global pandemic. This closure required me to shift my plans from in-person to remote. We were able to continue the work, but had to shift our projects to become electronic. Students were able to still listen to picture books, as there are many already recorded by celebrities, and I also recorded myself reading a few of the books too. So we continued our work with strengths and weaknesses by rereading, or rather listening to the story again. Students then completed a reflection on their own strengths and weaknesses. They were asked to reflect on what they viewed as their strengths, weaknesses, and who could help them improve their areas of weakness. Based on these reflections, as students listed specific strengths and weaknesses, they were grouped into categories, which include academic, things such as reading, math, and spelling, artistic, which includes drawing or singing, physical, which included sports, swimming, and dancing, collaborative, which included projects and games, emotional, things such as friendships, speaking up, and being funny. The results showed that students identified strengths in artistic and physical categories with 23.8%, and collaborative and emotional areas following close behind at 19%. When looking at the weaknesses or areas of growth, they were grouped in similar categories, although I replaced collaborative with responsibility, which included chores and things requiring students to show responsibility. 33% of students listed emotional areas as something they could grow in. These included friendships, being funny, telling jokes to others, speaking up, letting other people know their opinion, etc. Both artistic and physical came in second with 25% of students responding in these areas. Students identified riding a bike, playing a sport, drawing, and singing as some of their areas of growth. Responsibility and academics came in both at 8.3%, with students identifying household chores and reading as areas they can grow in. When students were asked who can help them improve in their weakness, students responded with parents, teachers, and a therapist. I anticipated, since this was an open-ended question, that friends or peers would be a response students would have made, but actually no students identified friends or peers as a person who could help them improve. Parents were identified at 62.5%, followed by teachers at 25%. I anticipate that the fact that we are not in school also played a role in these responses. More students shared strengths and weaknesses beyond just academics, which I would anticipate having been different had the reflections been done or completed in school. I also expect that since students are home with their families during the school closure, teachers were not as high of a person who can help improve weaknesses since their parents were the adults that they turned to when they needed support. It is also likely that if this reflection were completed within the classroom, the results would be very different, as students would have focused much more heavily on academic responses and less on these outside of school responses. Students also may have responded that their peers and teachers are people they can turn to for support versus such a high percentage of parents. The ideas presented by students may actually be more accurate as to what they really feel are their areas of strength and weakness when we take away that academic focus. Although when thinking about these areas, they will most likely need to self-advocate. It will happen in the academic setting. So understanding and identifying the academic strengths and weaknesses is still important. Finally, students were asked on this reflection to connect their understanding of strengths and weaknesses to the importance of self-advocacy. Students responded in various ways, including, I think it will help me get better at my areas of growth, and it will help me be aware of my strengths. You know what your strengths and weaknesses are, so you can get better at them. I know you're not perfect at everything, but at least try. It will help you self-advocate by letting you know what you might need help on a certain thing. We next looked at goal setting using the book Giraffes Can't Dance, where students listened to the book, completed a reflection, and finally created vision boards where they set academic, personal wellness, and hobby and interest goals for themselves. The goals the students set for academics were able to be grouped into 5 areas. Focus, staying focused on academics or remote learning, reading, math, writing, and grades, getting better grades, or getting straight A's. When looking at the goals the students set for themselves, the goals varied based on the student's individual strengths and weaknesses. One student, for example, wrote an academic goal to get better at math. She has a learning disability in math, so that goal would be appropriate for herself. Other students, many of whom already have straight A's, wrote goals to get straight A's in all subjects. Students who set this goal were more likely to want to keep that going, especially in a time when grades were uncertain based on remote learning. Students were also asked to create personal wellness goals. In this area, goals were grouped into categories which included socializing, or spending time with others in a safe way, sleep, screen time, or reducing time on screens, emotional, talking about your feelings, doing what you love, and being balanced, health, washing your hands, eating healthy, and losing weight, and physical activity, walking, sports, running in place. When looking at these goals, many students wrote goals around screen time, health, like washing their hands or getting more physical activity. The students are writing these goals based on their current situations of being quarantined in their houses. And so to them, limiting screen time, which could be an easy way to pass time, is a great goal. Many students set goals around hand washing, which has been an important message sent during this time. Therefore, those are excellent goals for the students to set, as well as realistic and timely. Lastly, students were asked to create goals around their hobbies and interests. Many students set goals around increasing physical activity, such as sports and dancing, which when the parks are closed and outside time may be limited, is a realistic goal for students to set that they want to make sure they continue or increase their physical activity. For our lesson on communication, students listened to the book The Day the Crayons Quit and connected the ways the crayons communicated their needs and wants to both communication and self-advocacy through a reflection. Finally, we put everything together in a summative assignment. Students were asked to create a slideshow that included everything that they learned about self-advocacy while also showing themselves throughout the slides. Each of the presentations was incredibly different and unique to the individual child and showed what they learned about self-advocacy. The final slide, where students reflected about why self-advocacy was important, was wonderful. Some students recorded videos of why it was important, and others wrote about why it was important.
Self-advocacy means that you get what you want or need in a respectful way. It is important to me because I need to get what I want and need. It is good to learn how to advocate for yourself so that when no one else is around, you can still get what you want and need.
Self-advocacy is being able to speak up for yourself. People can't take advantage of you when you have self-advocacy. You won't follow what other people are doing, and you can be yourself if you have self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is important because without it, people wouldn't know how to get what they want or need. It's important to me because you keep emotions to yourself and family. Self-advocacy is also important because you need to be comfortable with yourself and others. Self-advocacy is important because it explains who you are. It explains your dislikes and likes. It explains your identity. It explains what you want and need. It explains that you are a special person. And if nobody knew all about you, there'd be no parties, conversations, play dates, and most importantly, nobody would know who you are.
Self-advocacy is important because sometimes you need help on things like, let's say, example, I'm doing my homework, and I don't understand. I don't say, hey, Mom, I need your help. And then I get frustrated, which is not good because you're not supposed to get frustrated if you need help. But then when my mom checks it, it's wrong. And she wonders, why is it wrong? That's because I didn't ask for help.
Through my work, I was able to learn a lot about myself, my teaching, and my students. I learned that students are resilient, and even with many disruptions, we're able to connect the skills needed to the overarching theme of self-advocacy, which was evident in their summative self-advocacy projects. Students were also able to generalize the skills to self-advocate, even when we began to work remotely. In fact, I would venture to say that the remote work required students to use self-advocacy skills more than when in the classroom, because we as teachers were not there every moment to provide support. So students had to either find other ways to figure things out when they got stuck, or reach out electronically to get support from us as teachers. Last, I learned there are many layers to navigating a classroom and using self-advocacy skills as a student. Students must have an understanding of themselves and relationships with both their peers and teachers. They must know their own strengths and weaknesses and be able to identify that they may need help with something. They must be able to communicate effectively and have the confidence in themselves to ask for support. To be able to do these allows students to effectively self-advocate. So as I think about what I've learned through my action research and what can be changed at the classroom and school level, I will continue to teach self-advocacy within our social emotional lessons. I will also share resources that I use to teach self-advocacy with other teachers. I will also work to align the school's social emotional curriculum to include lessons on self-advocacy. At the district level, I would encourage administrators to understand the importance of self-advocacy skills at younger age levels. I would also encourage teacher training to teach self-advocacy in more classrooms across the city. As a nation, I want more value placed on self-advocacy skills at a younger age. I also implore the Department of Education to invest in the creation of a self-advocacy curriculum for elementary aged students. Thank you.
I'm going to do it for everybody, but you can probably see a lot of people who are giving you some hand claps from all 58 people that we have in this space right now. Evan, thank you so much. It was incredibly powerful hearing about how your story continued into remote learning and how something that could have just been the end of this kind of research in some ways was like a new beginning. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We have a question that you had mentioned your classroom context toward the beginning, but if you could talk a little bit more about that, how did you differentiate for students kind of across the classroom? Remind us of your grade level and tell us a little bit more about the differentiation side.
Sure. So we are a 4th grade inclusion classroom. There are 8 students with disabilities that are fully included. So all of their support comes from me and my co-teacher as within the context of the general education classroom. I work directly with her to differentiate any content that is being presented. A lot of the work in the self-advocacy skills that I taught over the course of the year were differentiated in the sense that the students, the reflections and the projects that they completed were very open-ended. So I didn't have a lot of criteria and allowed students to kind of work at their own pace and complete it as they could, and that how they felt comfortable. And a lot of the work that they did turned out wonderfully.
Thank you. And that question was from Kristen Dockery. I just want to give questions credit where they're due. A second question, again related to planning a little bit, is from Gina Cipriani. Did you incorporate the self-advocacy lessons into your IB units? For people who are not familiar with IB, that's International Baccalaureate, and Evan might be able to talk a little more about that.
Sure. So in the context of this work, we didn't. We actually incorporated them more into our SEL lessons that we taught each week, which we incorporated them. Our school uses the 2nd step curriculum. So we incorporated and embedded the self-advocacy lessons into that. But it would be really great to see how we could also work these lessons within our IB units. And a quick synopsis of IB, we teach 6 units throughout the year that are transdisciplinary. So we try and incorporate as many of the content areas into our units as we can.
Thank you, Evan. A quick plug, a reminder to fill out a feedback form for Evan, and also if there's anyone who would rather hear their voice asking the question than my voice asking the question, if you do want to use the raise hand function, I'm also keeping an eye on those. In the meantime, I have another question for you. Do you think that this kind of self-advocacy work would be helpful for students taking on more leadership over their IEPs over time? This was from Paula Kluth, and she said this was so fantastic. She loves this, and she says that because we so often hear about self-advocacy in relation to disability, we want to think about how this can be used for all students. What are your thoughts about how that might then be used for advocating within their kind of diverse learning plans?
So in my research, in my literature review, when I was reviewing the research that's out around self-advocacy, a lot of the work is for older kids, kids in middle school, high school, and college level. There isn't a lot of research out there for teaching self-advocacy to younger students. And the research that I read was around students with disabilities self-advocating for their IEPs. So explicitly teaching what their disability is, what it means, how they best learn, and relating that directly to their IEP. What are their IEP goals? What are their accommodations and modifications? And how they can respectfully talk with teachers and communicate and advocate for themselves to make sure that those goals are being met and those accommodations and modifications are being implemented within their classroom. I think starting at this younger age and building students' understanding of how they can effectively communicate and what their strengths and weaknesses are will only empower them at older ages to advocate for themselves in their classrooms and around their IEPs.
Thank you. And did you find that there were some students who seemed like they weren't improving in their understanding of advocating for themselves and understanding kind of themselves in self-advocacy? And if that happened, what did you do?
It was a little challenging to know, since about half our year was done remotely. But what I can say is there are a few students with and without disabilities that I kind of watched over the course of the year. And one student in particular at the beginning of the year self-advocated for himself. You know, any chance that he could, he would raise his hand and ask a question. And as we implemented these lessons, we saw that he was much more thoughtful in his advocating. He would raise his hand when he truly had a question. And on the flip side, students, specifically a few students with disabilities, who were those students that would sit and wait for a teacher to come over to them. I saw throughout the year and even during the remote learning that they would send emails or raise their hand or come over to one of our desks and say, I need help with this. So overall, I didn't see a lot of students not really understanding or grasping that idea of identity or what self-advocacy is.
Well, then that makes this last question a perfect question for all of us who are educators. From Amy, she asks, how do you suggest that we work self-advocacy work into the classroom on a daily basis? Do you have any suggestions for quick hits that might be helpful for us wherever we are teaching?
I think there's always a way that we can work mini lessons into our daily instruction. I think, you know, as educators, we find a teachable moment in anything. So taking a moment where we see a student sitting and waiting and giving them that gentle reminder, you know, ask for help. Or in some cases, you know, and some things that I've done over the years is I've modeled for the student, I need help, and waited for them to repeat it to me. And then I was like, oh, you need help? How can I help you? What can I do? So I think, you know, there are many ways that we can fit these lessons. They don't have to be hour-long lessons. They can be short, quick hits throughout your day.
Thank you so much, Evan. And this is another plug for a use of the feedback form. If you're interested in having Evan reach out to you, possibly with more information, Kristen Dockery asked if you'd be willing to share your book list and your lesson plans and all your resources that we can mine.
Definitely.
In your feedback form, and if you've already sent it, you can send another one. You can definitely put your email address in and say, hey, please reach out to me. This gives us all a chance to steal from each other in a web of learning. So please use that. Evan, once again, thank you so much. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Really wonderful. And we are going to keep it literary as we move into our next presenter. Next up, we have Tiffany Gills.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Gills, and my presentation is called Walk a Mile in My Kicks: Why Diversity Matters in a Middle School Reading Curriculum. I'm at Walt Disney Magnet School on the north side of Chicago. And before you ask, yes, it is that Walt Disney. You know, with Mickey, Minnie, and the whole Disney crew. And yes, it is quite magical to work there. Home to over 1,500 students. I am a 6th grade science teacher. That's right, a science teacher who happens to also teach writing. Like all teachers, I wear many hats. Science is my passion and just so happens to also be a part of my responsibilities. Our school is best known for having an open-spaced learning environment, or pod classrooms, which means we don't have walls, and there are up to 7 classes being taught by different teachers at once. Magical, right? This is my 9th year teaching. 5.5 of those years have been at Disney, 2.5 at a CPS school in Humboldt Park, and 1 year in Atlanta. I am the unit of 11 girls and 13 boys, all from different backgrounds and from different areas of Chicago. It is a true representation of the city of Chicago's diversity. I have been waiting to teach this particular group of students since they were in 2nd grade. I met many of them in our school mission-based after-school program, and some of them are also on my boys and girls volleyball teams that I coach. Now, writing became every teacher's first period class several years ago. This was a bit of a challenge, and I honestly didn't know where to begin. So I decided, why not do a novel study? I love reading. Doesn't everyone? No. In fact, my 6th graders could probably live without reading. I began wondering what would be the best books to use in my writing class to engage my disinterested readers. I happened to find a book called Dear Martin that was about a teenage boy facing many of the social justice issues that are in today's society. My students immediately fell in love with this novel, which led me to my research question today. What happens to middle school students when they read about characters that look like them or share common characteristics? My goal this year was to read 2 novels with very different characters, but with story allowing students to find something relatable to themselves. Despite the very broken up year that we have had, we did manage to read 2 novels, Front Desk by Kelly Yang and Dear Martin by Nick Stone. While we read these novels, I wanted to know if my students' motivation for reading would change. I wanted to know what would happen to their reading growth and achievement when they were given novels to read. This was the one part of my research that is incomplete because of the school year ending early. But more importantly, I find that 6th graders tend to be a little judgmental and lack empathy for one another. They also have no idea how to even begin to describe who they are. So I wanted to see if I could change their perspectives about people who are different from them, while also helping them define who they are and who they want to be. We started reading Front Desk in November and Dear Martin in February. I chose both of these books because of their focus on social justice issues, race, the power of friendship, and both stories have main characters who are good role models. To discover answers to my questions, I used 5 data collection methods: surveys, which I gave once a month, written responses from our bell work, my teacher journal where I recorded different occurrences throughout the year, NWEA map reading scores from the spring of 2019 when my students were in 5th grade, and this year's winter 2020 scores, and Socratic seminars, which helped me observe my students while they discussed topics from the book. While I knew how my previous students felt about reading, I believed that it was important to know how this group felt. In the first novel survey, I found that 5 of them loved reading, 8 liked it, and 11 thought it was okay. My first instinct was to be excited since no one chose dislike. However, upon reflection, students may have been dishonest in their responses, so they wouldn't disappoint me. Next, I decided to track their reading and book checkouts from the library between January and March, since they take a library exploratories course weekly. What became apparent was that my students really love graphic novels, with the adventure and mystery genres coming in second and third. Many of my students who stated that they prefer reading graphic novels continue to do so until their final library checkout. A few became more interested in reading historical fiction and books about Black history because I taught many lessons on several historical events for Black History Month. They even found graphic novels about the Civil Rights Movement. While I did not see a dramatic change in motivation for reading amongst this group of students in our final survey, I still did not have anyone say they disliked reading. What this graph doesn't show you is the students who now like reading more than before, and the students who became a bit more honest in their opinions. In the final survey of the year, I learned that my students could relate to Justice and Dear Martin, and that they, like the classes before them, chose this as their favorite book. I also realized that I might have missed an opportunity with certain kids. I wonder if I added a third book, perhaps a graphic novel, would I have engaged more students, specifically the ones who could not relate to any characters in the books I chose. As I said before, my school is more diverse than most schools in the city of Chicago. So right now, race does not appear to be a determining factor in how my students choose books, but maybe that will change as they move out of my school. What did appear to be most important in choosing a book is learning about social justice issues and how to handle uncomfortable situations and problems. One of the more difficult parts of my research was figuring out how to have serious and somewhat uncomfortable conversations. I wanted to get to the heart of the issues I saw my students of color facing. My colleague and teammate, Mike Feinberg, introduced me to Socratic seminars this year. And after watching him implement it in his social studies class, I thought that this just might be what I was looking for. If you are unfamiliar with Socratic seminars, it is a formal discussion based on a text in which the teacher asks open-ended questions. The students usually sit in a circle where they see each other, responsible for 1, listening to one another, 2, thinking critically for themselves, and 3, articulating their own thoughts and their thoughts to the responses of others. I sit outside of the circle, and I only interject when necessary. That way students are in full control of the discussion. It takes a lot of preparation, modeling, and practice, like most other things. Surprisingly, the hardest part is getting students to feel comfortable enough to talk without being called on. But with practice, it becomes easier for most. I had 4 Socratic seminars this year, 3 for front desk and 1 for Dear Martin. Each time we had our discussions, I made a point to talk about the major themes in the books, which also coincided with many current events and social justice issues in the United States. Immigration, healthcare, stereotypes, racism, and prejudice were some of the main topics, to name a few. Uncomfortable, right? Well, these issues are in fact affecting 6th graders, and they have a lot to say about it. Here's a short clip of one of our discussions. You will hear students discussing the topics of stereotypes in the book Dear Martin.
First question today is, what are stereotypes and what are some examples you've seen in Dear Martin? And you can talk about front desk, but I prefer for you to talk about Dear Martin because that is our current text. And once we have Sophia start us off.
Well, I think the stereotype is when somebody thinks differently because of their ethnicity or race or how they look. Like, for example, in Dear Martin, when Justice was trying to help, they thought that he was trying to do something different, but he actually wasn't exactly trying to help them. And they thought that because of his race.
Yeah, I a stereotype of the live like at the party that it was in his house. They just said about us, wow, black people always so mad. I just live on.
Okay, so I have another one. So it's also in Dear Martin. It was when Manny quit the basketball team. He only joined because everybody
expecting. Since he was a tall black man, everybody thought basketball was fit. But he didn't want people to choose his path just because he wanted to like make his own path so people that he was so I'm gonna add our to these. So then another like part of that was a stereotype that everybody said your math's up or you can only do when your math is
This was one of our final conversations, and it was one of the best ones. My students had a lot to say about the events in Dear Martin, but they also opened up and shared their own experiences dealing with stereotypes and racism. Because one student shared how it hurt him to be called a terrorist because of his religion, it opened the door for several other students to share things that had happened to them. This student was not African American, but he made a personal connection to the story, and it helped him develop empathy. By watching this conversation unfold along with the previous ones, I was able to see my students empathizing with one another. They started to show support for each other in other classes, like when they cheered for my shy student Emerson when she had to do a presentation in social studies. They even became more protective of each other at recess. These Socratic seminars showed me what can happen to students when they read about characters that look like them or share common characteristics. By building this diverse community, I have helped each of my students see how they are more alike than different. I taught them to be allies for one another and hold off on judging someone before they get to know them. While working on helping my students to become more understanding of each other, I thought it would be important to help them do some self-reflection. 6th grade can be a difficult time because you're no longer a baby, but you're also not a teenager yet. You're starting to really come into being your own person. I started off by simply asking the students how they see themselves in 3 adjectives. I received a lot of positives, a few negatives, and some who could only describe themselves in the eyes of others, like Emerson, who said, "I'm imaginative, artistic, and funny. My mom mostly tells me the first 2. I asked Priscilla about the last one. But very few could tell me why they used the adjectives they selected. I realized by asking them to describe themselves in 3 adjectives, I wasn't asking the questions that I needed answers to. I was still hesitant to bring up race and religion because those questions seemed like they would be over my students' heads. Eventually, I got over it and gave my students a survey asking them how does their race, ethnicity, and religion affect their lives. In my research, I found that students who have a better understanding of their racial identity tend to be able to better handle life's stressors. Matthew said, "Since I'm Black, most people see me as a bad influence. But if I've known you for long enough time, you'll become less and less scared of me and other Black people. When someone is scared of me, I feel weird." Matthew's response was very much like several other Black and Latina students in my classroom. His response shows he realizes that people who aren't Black might not see him for who he actually is. I appreciate that he knows that he can prove the stereotypes he faces to be wrong. This survey was eye-opening because many of my students voiced their fears and concerns about life. It is very apparent that my students are aware of the historical inequalities and the injustices that are still happening today. I think it is good for them to talk about that. But I also want them to have a growth mindset and know that they can overcome any obstacles that they face. The most logical step for me after reading these surveys was to get my students to put our discussions into writing. I wanted them to address the stereotypes they are facing head on and show what they know to be true about themselves. This is Eva, my hidden gem. I call her my hidden gem because she's not always as outgoing and loud as many of the other students are, but her written work is always beautiful and she exudes confidence. Eva and her classmates were asked to write a 3-stanza poem addressing stereotypes the main character Justice was facing in Dear Martin. In each stanza, you list a stereotype as the first line, then in the following 3 lines, you negate the stereotype. And in the final line, you write something positive. After my students wrote a poem for justice, they had to write one for themselves. Here's Eva's. Just because I am Mexican, I am not a criminal. I am not illegal. I am not involved in drugs. I am a nice person. Just because I am tall, I am not super strong. I am not a bully or mean. I am not better than anyone. I am human. Just because I am a girl, I am not weak. I am not an object. I am not an easy target. I am mature. After reading through everyone's poems, I realize my kids hate stereotypes just as much as adults do. And they don't like being compared to someone else. They are in constant need of positive reinforcement and positive interactions. I think as adults, we forget that about middle schoolers because they're big and hormonal. However, they are big kids that still need love and kindness even when they're not at their best, especially then. They are still forming their identities, and as teachers, we have to remind them of how special and unique they are. Which brings me to this quote by R.S. Bishop. When there are enough books available that can act as both mirrors and windows for all of our children, they will see that we can celebrate both our differences and our similarities, because together, they are what makes us all humans. This quote leads me back to my question. What happens to middle school students when they read about characters that look like them or share common characteristics? My findings and my research led me to the following policy recommendations. 1, all students need to read diverse novels at every grade level as a part of the curriculum. Students need to see themselves in the literature they read early on. It is especially important in middle school as students are learning more about their identity. While it is essential to offer our students mirrors to themselves in books, it is equally important to give them a window to view people who are not like themselves. A committee should be formed that reviews diverse literature twice a year. These committees should be formed at the school level and within school districts. These committees should also have teachers connecting with a school librarian or a public library librarian to get recommendations. Funds will also need to be made available so schools can purchase sets of novels. 2, teachers need to foster a safe environment to have real discussions about race and identity in middle school. Middle school students struggle to understand themselves and people who are different from them. One way to start these conversations is peace circles, which are used in the restorative justice model. In order for peace circles to be done correctly, every teacher needs to be trained in restorative justice. Restorative justice is a theory of justice that focuses on mediation and agreement rather than punishment. This training should happen before a teacher starts their first day in the classroom because it will help build community and relationships. 3, as teachers, we often struggle to find the time to do the research to find books that are diverse and socially relevant. There needs to be yearly professional development on implementing diverse novel study into the classroom. This training should focus on providing resources to use during a novel study and lists of diverse novels that are updated yearly. 4, every school needs a library and librarians. If we want our students to be exposed to diverse literature, they need a place to go to find it. They also need someone who is well-versed in books for children. If we want to continue seeing diverse literature created, we have to expose children to books early on so they can be the future writers of those diverse stories. And finally, teachers should be encouraged to use more student-led conversations in the classroom. While it is difficult to release the reins of being in charge of the conversation, students often are more than capable of leading a discussion on their own when proper tools are given. I believe holding Socratic seminars while reading novels allows students to have real conversations where they can express their thoughts and ideas. Socratic seminars also give students time to discuss real-life issues in a constructive way. It should be mandatory for every teacher to attend a professional development class on Socratic seminar or some type of student-led conversation if this is to be done correctly. Our society is diverse, and we need to start normalizing reading about people who look like what we see. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Or anything else, Tiffany, I have to share a comment from KJ. She said she just has to share that Eva rocks. That poem was incredibly powerful. Thank you so much for sharing it with us and sharing kind of the spirit of all of your students and their creativity with us. Really, really inspiring stuff. A reminder from Sarah to please fill out the feedback form for Tiffany. I don't know why my video wasn't started. Sorry. Apologies for that. But please fill out your feedback form for Tiffany. And then first question goes to the Socratic seminar in particular. Sylvester Baugh appreciated that you really were focusing on students having difficult discussions and supporting them through that process. And you mentioned that the video that we saw was kind of an exemplar, right? It was one of the ones that felt like it was going about as well as you would want it to go. Was curious in hearing more about some of the challenges that you faced as you were walking students through this process.
So the biggest challenge is always getting people to talk. So something I realized in maybe the last two that I did was giving them sentence stems. So how do I agree with someone? How do I respectfully disagree? How do I add on to what someone's saying? So those sentence stems really helped guide them to figure out, this is how I can communicate and not feel like I'm stepping on anyone's toes. The other part was just, giving them the questions ahead of time. For some reason, at first I was hiding the questions. I'm like, well, if I tell you the night before or a couple days in advance, you can at least think about these things. Maybe you can take some notes and really bring that to the discussion so you feel more prepared rather than on the spot. And you don't have to think on the spot and think about what you want to say to your classmates. And I think that's really what made our discussion this time better. And then always it's a noise issue because we have no walls. So I took my kids out of the classroom. I said, let's go to a planning area where it's just us. There are no other classes, but of course you still get the noise from just the school. Anyone walking around, you hear them.
That is a challenge that is very real for you in a way that it is probably not quite as easy for some of us in traditional classroom settings to understand. Thank you for sharing that. Kristen Dockery would like you to think, now on the full process. We heard about Socratic seminars in particular, but looking at the entire year, what were some of your triumphs and trials through this process that you may not have already shared with us?
Oh my God, the first time we did this, I had students sharing in our classroom. No one else was there. And I remember the fire alarm went off, which obviously would seem like this is a really bad situation. But I had kids, as we were lining up to leave the school, they wanted to continue to talk. So I was like recording everything on my phone, and they took my phone and they were just recording their thoughts. They were like, we just want you to hear this later because this is really important to us. So that was one of the biggest triumphs, and that was on the first session. So I was very proud of that moment. Some of the, biggest struggles were, listening or not hearing my kids who are super quiet. They didn't want to talk, but I figured out how to get around that. I gave them a reflection sheet at the end. And that really let me know, are you listening? Are you internalizing what you're hearing? What questions do you have? What are you thinking now? How can you improve yourself? And so we kind of overcame that at the end, knowing I could still hear what they're thinking. I just am not going to hear it in the bigger circle.
Thank you. I think that you've kind of won over some followers. So Anne would like to know what the process is for a school to become a social justice trained school. Obviously, you were making some choices in your classroom, but within the context of your wider school. So what does that process look like? What are some takeaways that you've experienced being at Disney? Is there a cost to this? Things like that.
These are excellent questions. We are not actually a social justice trained school. So one of the things that I've seen this year is I have a colleague who's really good at peace circles. And I believe she or her husband is trained in it. So I watched them at lunchtime do these trainings or at least talk to her groups of students about issues that were going on. And I said, oh my God, this is amazing. So this summer, I'm actually looking to see how I can get training for myself. I'm hoping that my assistant principal and my principals will watch this and realize this is a good plan. This is a good step in the right way. And I know that we're bringing in people to our school that may just be using this model. So I don't have answers about costs and how to do that yet, but I am going to be exploring that this summer.
You'll get back to us.
Yes, I will.
So again, people who want to know more about that, please make sure that Tiffany knows to reach out to you so that she can share and spread kind of this information. The goal for this kind of policy forum is to be able to do that. I have a question from Nena Elumogo, which is, did you see different levels of engagement among students, given that the first novel had a female protagonist, the second novel had a male protagonist?
So the first novel, I didn't think anyone liked it. I thought the whole time, I'm like, they must really be bored. But I found out at the end, they all really loved that novel, and they wrote me little notes. They had to do like a text message note where they said, oh, Miss Gills, you know, this is what I think about the book. And a lot of them appreciated learning about the experiences of an immigrant family and how to overcome those struggles, being that the first character was in 5th grade. And they connected with those characters a little differently because the main character was Asian, and none of my students are Asian, but they could connect with each person because of personality or struggles or things that they were experiencing in that time. They obviously love Dear Martin because the majority of my class is African American. Even students who are not, they could really connect with it and really understand it because many of the issues in the book relate to actual things they're seeing in the news. We'd read newspaper articles that related to things that were in the book, and I think they made those connections a bit more because they're living through these experiences, and it helped them to say, you know, I connect on a deeper level. So I don't think there was, obviously we know Dear Martin was their favorite, but I don't think they chose one over the other overall, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And a final question, since we are in an environment of remote learning that could continue, from Deb Moretsky, do you think that it might be easier for middle schoolers to talk about these kinds of subjects online? Like if we were to continue remote, is this something that you are really thinking about moving forward?
I'm actually hosting a town hall with my kids tomorrow, so we will be talking about the things that are happening in the news. I think, you know, as long as you teach kids how to do this, and how to be respectful and how to voice like what you're thinking about and what's going on in your mind, that I think it's possible. I don't think that anything be impossible. We can use the chat function to ask questions if we needed to, but you know, I do believe that these children in 6th grade are more than capable of having discussions like this, even online.
And I'm gonna do a quick scan to see if I've got any raised hands. All right. Well, Tiffany, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it. Hadra, kudos.
Thank you.
And Tiffany is a science teacher who was talking about literacy, wearing multiple hats. Our final fellow of the evening is also a teacher who wears multiple hats, and she's going to talk to you about the ways that what she did for her action research, well, it's not the thing that she spends most of her day on. So really kudos to both Tiffany and our next presenter for that. Our final presenter of the evening is one of our senior fellows this year, so has been an amazing leader in the group, and is presenting her second action research project in 2 years. We're going to turn it over to Sky Black.
Thank you. All right. Good evening. My name is Sky Black, and I am a 7th grade social studies teacher at the University of Chicago Woodlawn Middle School, located on the south side of Chicago. By all means, please feel free to imagine those cartoon green lines wafting up from the feet that you see there. Helps you understand my struggle for the year. Before I jump into my research, I want to acknowledge the state of our city and our country right now. At UCW, I teach all Black and Brown students. I stand in solidarity with them and fight with them. This research journey is just one of the many ways I try to use my privilege to make positive change. I also want to start by explaining my why behind the research. I wholeheartedly believe in the effects of yoga, mindfulness, and meditation. Shortly after moving to Chicago in 2012, I found myself in a series of unfortunate set of life circumstances that led to severe depression and anxiety attacks. I was forced to take a break from grad school and was even hospitalized for a period of time. As I started to piece my life back together, I found a local yoga studio and decided to take a class. When I walked out of the yoga studio that day, not only had I taken a class, but I was also signed up for yoga teacher training. To this date, that feels like the closest thing to destiny I've ever experienced. I'm now a 200-hour certified yoga instructor. I'm also certified by the Kripalu Yoga in Schools program and the Prison Yoga Project. Yoga quite literally saved my life. And after working with adolescent students for many years, I knew it would have an impact on my students as well. What my data confirmed for me from the beginning was that students needed yoga and they needed it badly. There are 2 graphs here, each one from a pre-survey administered to 23 of my yogis before the program began. This first graph shows how often students felt happiness. What was concerning to me is that 11 students said that they don't feel happiness often. The second graph looks at anger. The latter half of that bell-shaped curve is troubling to me, especially as you can see one student wrote in that he always feels angry. When I asked students to honestly answer what they do when they feel anger, stress, or anxiety, I got answers like this. Some students were able to identify effective strategies for emotional regulation. However, as you can see here, many students relied on tactics such as lashing out or bottling up their feelings. My school uses a punitive behavioral system of demerits and referrals to the dean's office that accumulate to further consequences such as detention or in-school suspension. In our 3rd month of school, as I was confirming my research topic for ARLI, students were busy racking up impressive numbers of demerits and referrals. In fact, the numbers were increasing exponentially from week to week, with 1,809 behavioral demerits and 154 referrals written by October 21st. In the table, you can see here that the number of behavioral infractions are far from evenly distributed amongst our school's 250 students. Since my ARLI research last year, I have become increasingly critical of my school's ladder of consequences. If the number of behavioral infractions are increasing from week to week, the logical conclusion is that our current system does not work. We need to teach our students how to regulate their emotions. We need to increase their stress resiliency, help students manage traumatic experiences, and help build their self-esteem. This is where yoga came in, and all 5 of these students were at the top of my list for who should join me. This data motivated me to ask the following guided question. What happens when middle school students participate in a yoga, mindfulness, and meditation class? I wanted to track how students utilize the different techniques, how it impacted my relationships, and how students' mood and energy level changed throughout class. But before I explain my yoga journey at Woodlawn, I want to give you a little taste of a yoga class. I have pre-recorded a short video to attempt to avoid any technology issues, and I ask that you follow along with me. Hi, thank you guys for joining me in a quick warm-up activity. So we are going to do a little activity. I'm going to teach you alternate nostril breathing and talk a little bit about how that impacts your brain. And then we're going to do a little test to see if that improves our brain function at all. So I'm going to start by bringing it back to probably elementary school for you, where we used to play patty cake or whatever that was. So I want you to follow after me. You're going to start by patting your knees twice, then clap your hands twice. Then you're going to take your right hand to your nose, left hand to your right ear, and give a little pat. Don't smack too hard because you will inevitably end up hitting yourself in the face. Then we're doing the opposite side. Right hand to left ear, left hand on your nose. Let's try a little faster. Struggling is okay. I've had a lot of practice with this. Go one more round. Okay. How many people found that challenging? I know the first probably 20 times I did that, I ended up smacking all parts of my face and my knee and my hands at the same time. That's okay. And so we're going to learn about alternate nostril breathing. It is a specific breathing technique that is really good. It can help calm your body down, calm your nervous system down, but it also has a really unique aspect to it that it helps our brain function. There's a lot of data that shows that it helps the 2 different hemispheres of our brain work together.
So you have your right hemisphere that controls your left side of your body and is the more creative side of your brain. And then you have the left hemisphere of your brain that controls the right side of your body and is the more analytical, mathematical side. There are a lot of situations where you probably want those to be working together really well, maybe before a big test, a big presentation, or some kind of big game. And so there's a new body of research that shows that alternate nostril breathing can actually help that happen. So I'm going to teach you how to do it, and then we're going to see if our padding and clapping game improve any after we try alternate nostril breathing. So to do that, make an L with your fingers. You're going to take your thumb and place your thumb over your right nostril. Then you're going to breathe in through your left nostril. Swap your fingers so you're exhaling through the right nostril. Inhale right. Swap your fingers, exhale left. Inhale left. Swap your fingers, exhale right. Inhale right. We're gonna do 2 more rounds, exhale left. Try one on your own. All right. Now let's come back to our game and see if there's any difference. So again, pat, pat, clap, clap. Tap your nose and your ear, try it again. Keep going, see if you can go any faster. Challenge yourself go as fast as you can. All right, did anybody feel or notice any difference with how easy or hard that was?
So raise your hand if this activity got any easier for you. I'll be quite honest with you, I can't see any of you, but I'm hoping that there are at least a few people with their hands raised. My year of teaching yoga can ironically be described as nothing less than a journey in flexibility. I started off teaching yoga as a replacement to detention. If students accumulated enough referrals or were involved in escalated behavioral situations, they were required to attend after-school yoga. Though a new name probably would have been beneficial, I quickly found out that this could not be my focus of my research for ARLI. Without consistent exposure to the strategies I was teaching, and with a different group of students each week, it would have been near impossible to gather meaningful data from it. So I did some rethinking and decided that in order to make a real impact, this needed to be a consistent group of students from week to week. And as luck would have it, a class that I had been voluntold to teach at the beginning of the year was removed from my plate, and I suddenly had 4 free periods. Was this destiny again? I worked with my dean of students who fully supported my work, and she helped me come up with a list of students and a schedule. With so many students identified as potentially benefiting from this program, we came up with an 8-week program that students would attend once a week. We focused on dividing students up by grade level, and I gave it a try. That was in-school yoga version 1, and it lasted about 2 weeks. I realized a couple of things in those 2 weeks. The first, which probably should have been obvious to me, was that if you put middle school boys and middle school girls in a room together and then ask them to move their bodies in new ways, you are absolutely not going to have their undivided attention. In a final reflection from one of my yogis, she stated, "We would not have gotten a lot done because boys like to play." I was also moving from room to room and found it was hard when I didn't have the ability to control the environment. Students, teachers, and security guards would pass by the room wide-eyed as I did yoga in whatever corner was the least disruptive to the other teacher's space. It made kids self-conscious and did not provide a safe environment for them to explore these new things. It was also around this time that I was researching what other in-school yoga programs look like. And every single program was considerably longer than the 8-week program of version 1. At the end of first semester, our school made some major changes to our schedule. With the dean as my biggest cheerleader, she fought for my own room to be available for yoga. She also helped me rework the schedule again. This time we identified the 29 students we felt would benefit the most. We separated them by gender this time and grade level and decided to keep them in a program for the remainder of the year. It required me to teach 1 extra yoga class, bringing my total to 5 each week. And so became in-school yoga version 2. Again, I really need to work on these names. It seemed like I had finally figured out a mostly successful program that I thought was going to last 18 weeks. However, as we all know, was tragically cut short by the cancellation of in-person learning. I got a solid 7 weeks in. The overwhelming response was positive when I asked students how they felt about joining me for yoga. I got responses like excited, hashtag, back with Ms. Black. Some kids were a bit indifferent, and there were, of course, 4 students that did not want to be there. One of those students I will talk about more closely at the end. I found that the factors that had the biggest impact on a student's willingness to participate were based on prior relationships with me, their exposure or lack thereof to yoga, seeing value in yoga and mindfulness, what class I was pulling them from, and of course, the relationships with other students in the group. But before I move on to the next slide, I want you to conjure an image of what comes to mind when you think of yoga. So just take a moment to think of that. I would bet a new air freshener on the fact that it looked nothing like these pictures. This is what it looks like to teach yoga in a middle school. I only wish I could have captured certain times, like when I asked students to raise both arms above their heads, and Brianna, looking completely unamused, stuck up one pointer finger and then the other. Or the time that Corey picked up his yoga mat and smacked Armand in the head with it. A program that was supposed to reduce stress with my students often elicited quite the opposite in me. It was time-consuming and tedious to figure out the schedule, frustrating when students were absent, annoying to have to rearrange my room so frequently, and disheartening when I saw students immediately engage in problematic behaviors following a yoga class. But despite those challenges, I wouldn't change a single thing about how the year played out, except for, of course, how the year ended. Through every attempt and mistake made, I took away myriad lessons that I believe will allow me to create a sustainable in-school yoga program moving forward. Here are a few of the lessons that I learned. Lesson 1, I need yoga. This is a quote from one yogi who endearingly started referring to me as mom after he started yoga with me. The goal of action research is not to prove anything, and especially given the abrupt ending to the school year, I can't tell you how long-lasting the impact of yoga was. But what I can say, and what the student was expressing here, is that students quickly discovered that yoga makes them feel good. Most of my data shows that for at least 1 hour each week, students felt more positive and reached a more desirable energy level. For every class, I asked students to identify 2 factors: their mood from negative to positive, and their energy level from high to low on this graph. They had a magnet with their name on it and moved it accordingly before and after. The graph that you see here was not always the norm. This is probably the best example I could show, but to me, it was a beautiful thing. And it wasn't long after I started pulling students for yoga that I started to get other students begging me to join. And interestingly, by the end of the year, it was the students that were forced to attend after-school yoga detention that were the main students asking to be pulled for in-school yoga. Lesson 2, find your ally and leverage those relationships. Every in-school program needs a cheerleader that has some kind of power at that school. My cheerleader was Miss Eggleston, our Dean of Students. Though she was already in support of teaching yoga at the beginning of the year, she became more invested as soon as our first after-school yoga detention ended. As we were walking the group of 8 boys back upstairs, she whispered to me with surprise, "They are noticeably calmer." And for that specific group of boys, it was a really big deal. She supported every version of teaching yoga at UCW. Find yourself a Miss Eggleston. Lesson 3, food equals love and happiness. I grew up in a family, many of whom are here right now, where we showed our love through food. It came as no surprise to me when students identified food as being a factor that made them happy. In fact, it was the second most common response, following closely behind friends, of course. When I saw these results, I began to think about what I could give students after a yoga class. Passing out a bag of Flamin' Hots didn't feel quite right and would have been expensive. I needed something smaller, more sustainable, and a little less spicy. As I was thinking about what students could take with them, I began to think about more than just food. Seeing as how I was only able to meet with students once a week, I wanted them to have a little reminder of the way they felt during yoga class later on that they could come back to. And as I was brainstorming, I remembered one class taught at the Kripalu Institute, where the teacher put encouraging words and positive affirmations on Post-its and asked us to take what we needed on our way out. I wasn't quite sure a Post-it would do it for my students, but if I taped a Starburst to it, which was my signature in-class treat, I might just have the desired effect. I gave it a try and the results delighted me. As students made their selection, I heard phrases like this being uttered. I'm taking optimism because that's what I need. I also watched as Tony, a sixth grader who frequents the dean's office, took the phrase, I got this, and then whispered it to himself several times as he was headed towards the door. It was simple and effective. One student even told me that he taped all of his affirmations to his dresser at home. Lesson 4, getting a taste of my own meditation. Meet Crystal. Crystal is the epitome of adolescence wrapped into one body. She's the type of student that I describe as being kind of like a cat. She wants to come to you on her own terms, but any forced interactions can result in disastrous effects. She was new to UCW this year and had a rough start. Of those 1,809 demerits, 38 were Crystal's. And as a 13-year-old, she had already developed an intimate relationship with mental health issues. So of course, she was the top of my list for in-school yoga. She started off skeptical and irritated. She later explained that she thought she was in trouble the first time I pulled her for yoga. But Crystal quickly began to love yoga. At the end, she described that her favorite part was the calming of my voice. She was also able to describe multiple times where she wanted to punch something, mostly her little brother, but learned to pause, take a letting go breath, which was her favorite, and often found the desire to punch him had lessened. My favorite moment with Crystal was on one of the most challenging days I've ever had teaching. I found out that there had been essentially an underground cheating ring going on in my classroom, and I was devastated. I had to have some of the hardest conversations of my career with students and families. This happened on Crystal's yoga day, and she was the only student in her group present. Take a listen to what she had to say. Ooh, sorry.
Do you remember that day?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you were thinking, what you were feeling, what that was like for you?
I just wanted to try to calm you down because you seemed really angry. So I had asked you, did you want to do it? I asked you, did you want to like practice like you breathe and then do the stretches that I did?
What was that like with the roles kind of reversed in that class?
I actually enjoyed it. It was just like I was a lot happier that you felt better after that.
So for those of you that know middle schoolers, that level of empathy is rare and is something that I will treasure forever. At Crystal's specific request, I cannot wait to continue teaching her yoga next year. For my last lesson, I want to introduce you to Brandon. As teachers, we all know that one student that can make us look like we are the absolute best teachers. They always ask the perfect questions during a formal observation or know how to casually greet any visitor and perfectly state the day's objective. That is not Brandon. Brandon is actually quite the opposite. He was in my social studies class last year and we had a really rough year together. Remember that student that wrote an always for how often he felt anger? That was Brandon. So when his name ended up on my list of students for the first after-school detention, and then again on my list of potential students for in-school yoga, you can imagine that I was more than hesitant. I will embarrassingly admit that after spending hours creating that final list of student participants with Ms. Eggleston, I sent her a message later that night saying, I think I'm gonna take Brandon's name off the list. I just don't see it going well with him there. Had it not been for a gentle nudge and a reminder that this may be an opportunity to rebuild what was broken, I would have, and more importantly, Brandon would have missed out on the most epic journey of what will most definitely look like no progress at all, but really was of all time. Let me describe a few wins. My first win. Hey, Brandon, did you 100% hate yoga yesterday? 95%. My second win. Brandon, can you rate your energy level and mood before yoga? What about after yoga? Moves his magnet exactly 1 millimeter closer to the positive. And my third one, Brandon, I'm feeling really sick today. Is it okay if we skip yoga? Brandon, I can't be in this room right now. Can I at least just come take a nap with you? So like I said, it seems like no progress at all, right? Well, here's a few things I left out. Brandon had an agreement with Miss Eggleston that if at any point he didn't want to continue yoga, he didn't have to. Brandon showed up every week but one. In fact, he was often the only student that would stop by to help me set up the room. So even though his mood and his energy level might have remained concerningly low even after yoga, the fact that he showed up every week spoke loud and clear. But my biggest win with him was the progression of his response about doing yoga with me. In the beginning, when asked about how he felt doing yoga, Brandon was the one who said, "I don't want to do it. It never helps. Miss Eggleston asked me," which was a fair response given the challenges of our prior relationship. At the end, when I asked Brandon what he liked about doing with yoga with me, he responded by saying everything. Now that is something I can imagine we can all agree on as being a major win. It also leaves me wondering how different Brandon's life would be if he had been exposed to yoga and meditation at a much younger age. This leads me directly into my policy recommendations. As you can see from Brandon and Crystal's story, yoga makes students feel good. And there are a lot of things we can do to make this more accessible to young people, starting with what I can do as a teacher. I want to incorporate quick meditations and breathing techniques into my social studies class, and will continue to seek out more trainings on trauma-responsive yoga. I also want to provide yoga classes for teachers who need it just as much as students. For my school, I think we need to minimize our reliance on the ladder of consequences and hold teachers accountable by having them review their own write-ups. I think yoga should become an integral part of our school, which includes training other teachers so it can be reinforced frequently. And lastly, as a nation, and most importantly, I believe we should begin teaching yoga, mindfulness, and meditation at a much younger age. So as I end, I invite you to virtually take what you need. Carry this affirmation with you through your evening and through the rest of your week as a gentle reminder of whatever it is that you need to hear. Thank you.
Sky, thank you so much for that. It is a wonderful way to be able to end the evening with us thinking about what we need and us thinking about what the students, in our communities need. So a really powerful way to end this first evening. Major appreciations here. A final reminder of the evening to please complete a feedback form for Sky. Sarah has shared it in the chat box, and a reminder to continue sharing questions. If you have questions, you can either do it using the hand raise function, which you can get to in the participants list, or you can privately chat it to me or to the Chicago Foundation for Education. A question, and sorry to start with kind of a downer, but a question that's a little bit real. Were there students who didn't progress? Were there students who didn't show the kind of inspirational growth that we saw from the two students here?
Yeah, of course, right? We're working in a middle school, and middle schoolers are at that age where some things work really well for some students and some things completely backfire. And so that was something that I struggled with the whole year, was whether or not I forced students to participate in yoga, because there were a handful of students that just didn't want to do it. And so Brandon, the student I described, was kind of a special case because we had such a challenging situation. So we had that agreement set up with the dean, but there was one other student, the one that gave me the one finger and then the other when I asked her to raise her hands, that I eventually asked her to stop coming. I found that she made it so vocal how much she didn't want to be there that it started to have a bigger impact on the other students that were with her. And I found that it was not her being there. I don't know how much she benefited from it. And I think that it impacted the other students enough that it may have started to get in the way of their experience. And so it wasn't her time to access yoga. And I think it is for a lot of students, but I also recognize that not everybody's going to be ready. And I think forcing someone to do something can have really negative effects. So it's still something that I toy with. I felt like I wanted to force students to at least try it a couple of times because it is something that was so new. But then if they really were still vocal about not wanting to do it, then I would tell them that they didn't have to continue.
It's like the no thank you bite.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, like we had asked Evan for some quick hits that a teacher who is perhaps not nearly as versed as you are in yoga and mindfulness, but is interested in incorporating some of the techniques that might be supportive to our students. Do you have any quick hits or strategies that you could share with us as classroom teachers?
Absolutely. So I think any of the breathing activity that I led you guys through, that was 3 minutes, just over 3 minutes. So that was a pretty quick thing. There are lots of different breathing techniques you can teach. So I mentioned the letting go breath with Crystal's being her favorite. And that is literally breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth and just sighing it out. And I always say to students, that's like I know you all know how to do this because you do that to us all the time as teachers. As soon as we ask you to do something you don't want to do. So there's lots of quick breathing techniques you can do. There are resources like Calm Classroom that are available that have some activities, but even just movement breaks too. That kind of tied into some of my research from last year. Kids need to move. It's hard to sit down for an hour. I'm realizing that with remote learning, like I need to be standing up and moving. And so even if you're noticing that the energy level of your class is really low, make them all stand up. And they're, if you teach middle school, they're all going to roll their eyes at you, but they do that all the time anyway. So make them stand up, make them move, do a quick energizer, make them shake out their legs and arms. And, I think I learned to read the energy of the room a little bit. So maybe we need something that's a little bit calmer. They're coming in after lunch and everybody's buzzing around. And so that might be the time where I do an actual breathing technique. And that's something that I want to do more. I was really focused on the groups that I was working with, but I think for next year, whatever learning looks like, it is something that I want to try to incorporate with my whole class even more.
That segues directly into the next question, which was, in whether it is in a remote scenario or in a school scenario, you've just told us one hope that you have for in your classroom. What are some other hopes that you have for yourself teaching yoga moving forward?
Well, I think the journey throughout the year where I ended, taking into account all of the lessons that I learned, I can kind of start where I left off. I don't have to go through all of those mistakes again, or lessons, I guess, not just mistakes. So I can kind of pick up there, knowing that I need to have groups divided by gender, knowing that I need to have it in my room. And I also, again, have the support of Miss Eggleston, who is making sure that I have a full day off of teaching, and so that I can do all of my classes in one day, because that got to be really hard teaching social studies, then excusing those kids, moving all the chairs and tables to the side, as you can see, getting my yoga kids, and then teaching a class after that where I have to hurry and put everything back together. And so I think that, she's really been open to hearing what I learned and helping me to implement that into the program so that it isn't so much of a headache, just the small day-to-day issues. I'm also really hoping to have, outside of my room there's like a little alcove, to have posters with yoga poses on it and stepping other kids through breathing techniques, so that if kids need to take a break in the hallway, and maybe I'll even have yoga mats sitting right there, they know that that's something that they can do. It's a technique that they can rely on to help calm themselves down, so that they can come back and be in a place where they can actually learn within an actual classroom.
Thanks. So then, thinking about techniques, I have a question from Barbara Claw. She asks, why specifically yoga? She says she studied mindfulness for years and used to do yoga regularly, but now finds that things that are more active, like Zumba, are actually much more calming for her. And so she's wondering, would you consider doing other forms of energy work beside yoga?
Absolutely. I leaned on yoga because that's what helped me. And so I knew that it had an impact. And I think what is really special about yoga is that it combines movement, breathing, and your mind at the same time. And I think that other forms of movement, you get so focused on the movement part that you kind of lose track of the mindfulness and the breathing techniques. So with yoga, you can get students into a really challenging pose and then hold them in that for an extra breath or two and have them breathe through whatever emotions are coming up or whatever feelings are coming up in their body. and they learn to really just breathe through it. And then they can start to take those things off of their yoga mat. So now I'm in a situation where I'm really upset. Let me just learn to pause, like Crystal had said, breathe. I know that this is going to be temporary, and now I can react. So I think that it translates pretty directly into other areas of their life in a way that something like Zumba may not necessarily do as much, but it's still great. I love Zumba.
Thank you. Thank you for your openness about that, as well as all of the challenges. I have one final question coming in from one of your prior colleagues. Fun fact, Sky and I actually are colleagues, so I've got firsthand, and it's been awesome. And one of her former colleagues and a previous action researcher, Spencer Angel, asks, have you been able to stick with yoga as a substitute for detention? How did that go? And what are you thinking about that moving forward in terms of like the connection with the dean's office?
So that was probably the more challenging part of this, because I was so reliant on another person to put all of the details of that together. So the dean was the one who reached out to families and informed them that they had to stay after for an hour. And this year we had a new principal. Things were kind of crazy, and she was really overwhelmed. And so there were some times where she wasn't able to make those phone calls to alert families that their child had to stay, and so we couldn't technically hold them. But as we got, so it was a little rocky in the beginning, but then as the year progressed, right before it ended, we got a little bit more in the groove of things, and they were really powerful. So we would do a half hour of yoga, and then we would do a half hour of a peace circle with some kind of story or guiding question that wasn't, you know, what did you do? How are you going to do it better the next time? It wasn't a written reflection. It was just to get them talking about their feelings and their emotions. And sometimes they would be kind of related to what the general actions were, but sometimes just a way to kind of get them to open up. So it's definitely something that we plan on continuing whenever we make it back to school. And I think it's something that I'm hoping can be more consistent. But kids were really surprised. I remember a lot of students walking away like, I didn't think that was what detention was going to be like, but they walk away feeling good. And hopefully having a strategy or two, because this punitive system is not, like I said, it's not working. And we need to be able to teach kids strategies so that they don't end up in those situations again in the future. And if they do, they know how to handle them besides exploding or bottling everything up.
Thank you. A powerful story and a powerful end to our first evening. I don't know about other people who are out there, but I know that I leave this kind of work feeling so energized. We heard from 4 diverse and really creative educators who were thinking about very different ways of connecting with their students and understanding the kinds of data that let them make meaningful change in their classrooms and in their practice. So once again, thank you to Helena, to Evan, to Tiffany, to Sky. You are all wonderful, and we are so happy that we got a chance to hear from you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sue to close us out.
Thank you everybody for attending. Kate's done thanks to the fellows who've done a wonderful job. The presentations were just delicious. Thank you. Thank you to CFE for putting all this together, and for the we hope the guests will join with us next week, perhaps same time and similar place, but you need to be registered for it. Please complete the evaluation forms, and once again, I mean, I'm just, you 4 guys, you're just fantastic, and I'm so thrilled to have heard your presentations and seen you through the year. It's been wonderful. To everybody else, hope to see you next week. Bye.
Bye everyone, thank you.